Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's disagree on some stuff. Let's learn some things about ourselves and each other through the art of rhetoric and discussion, where you guys respond to a post I put up here on the Ubes of Twos and tell me your controversial opinions on maybe some general things you think, or maybe a direct response to something I've said here on the channel. And without any further ado, let's get into the bloodshed. Come lady, sugar, baby. This is not the response you are looking for, ... but the response you shall get. Put Pips in a bow tie. Maybe he can be a co-host for a video. This is important stuff. I would love to, but if you put anything around his neck, he kind of loses his goddamn mind and will kind of actually almost hurt himself to get it off. It's why I can't even put a collar on him. So maybe I'll include Pips in some more videos, in fact. He's right here, but nuzzling at my feetsies, being all cute. But in terms of like trying to control the force of nature that is Pips, I've given up on that long ago. C.S. Lewis isn't for everyone, but he does deserve his legacy. He influenced even Philip Pullman in writing his Dark Materials. Maybe not in the traditional way, as Pullman wanted the anti-Narnia, but that is still influence. Granted, most of his Dark Materials is just a retelling of Paradise Lost, but I do remember an interview or article where he stated that his work being the anti-Narnia. Yeah, you're right. C.S. Lewis did have a great influence, and I never mean to try and degrade that influence by saying he's not for me or I don't like what he is personally putting out or put out. He's not with us anymore. But yes, there is a fine distinction between me saying I don't like someone versus I don't think their influence exists. No, Lewis has great influence on a lot of fantasy, and I think many modern authors may even credit him still for helping them get their own work style established. But again, I just don't like the guy. Like, I don't enjoy Dune, but I fully acknowledge it's a brilliant work, and Frank Herbert was massively ahead of his time. I can not like something and still respect it, and I encourage you to embrace that mentality as well, because once you realize that you can respect works of art you don't necessarily enjoy, the world becomes a lot happier and more open to you just kind of looking at people and enjoying them liking things that maybe you don't like. And that's kind of a beautiful approach to entertainment. I don't understand this mentality of like, if I like it, everyone has to like it, or they're wrong. That's not how entertainment works. There is still a place for tales of good versus evil. Not everything has to be morally ambiguous. That's true, Carl. I will push back on this a bit and say that they have been told so much that it's hard to add something new to that dynamic. You know, as a writer coming into the foray today, I think it's a lot more appealing and you have a lot more original options to you if you approach it with this more morally ambiguous lens. I mean, if you set up your moral system to be similar to like Star Wars, where it's literally light side versus dark side, then it's pretty difficult to kind of tell a story around that is extremely new. I'm not saying it's impossible, it can absolutely still be done, but I think the reason morally ambiguous is such the big deal currently is because it hasn't been done as much, and it certainly opens more doors than it closes. Bigger world does not necessarily equal better world building. I'd take a small fleshed out world over a massive shallow world any day. I don't think anyone's arguing that a big, not well fleshed out world is impressive. I think everyone's saying they like big fleshed out worlds, so it kind of twists your comment a little bit because you're trying to hit a really low hanging fruit of like, oh yeah, small fleshed out world, great. Shallow big world, bad. I don't think anyone in the world is going to disagree with that. It's kind of a low hanging fruit there. I'm going to call you out on it. Lukewarm take, and it's actually a pretty spicy take. Not every fantasy novel needs alternate races or humanoid species or caste systems. Just give us some bros casting spells, not half siren, elf, blood mage fairies. Boy, do I have a book to recommend to you. No, yeah, this is completely true, and I think is actually very common right now in the more mild fantasy stories we're seeing, where the fantasy elements are downplayed. We're seeing a lot more of just like casual life with a fantasy twist. Especially in YA, this is big from what I understand in my recent education I've received from multiple people. But I think also we're seeing the big mainstay adult fantasy go this way as well. And that's why in just the lifespan of this channel, I've had people go from calling me insane for lumping Stephen King in with fantasy to entirely agreeing with me and going, yes, Stephen King is a fantasy author in every sense. It's because the trend is now different and more minimal fantasy is on the uptick and more people are aware of it. Bad adaptation does not equal bad movie slash TV show slash game. They are not synonymous. You can have a good time while experiencing something that was adapted poorly from the source material, and not just in an ironic way. I get what you're saying, but you can absolutely make both cases here. It entirely depends on the source material, right? Some things need to be adapted poorly in the sense you're talking about because the source material has not necessarily aged well, perhaps. Or there's just some element that can't be brought to screen, so they adapted it in the way you're talking about poorly. Especially before VFX were as cheap and easy to do as they are now. Not saying that they're cheap and easy across the board, don't mean to disrespect that industry, but you get what I'm saying. They would cut elements to a story that they just couldn't fit in their budget. So I wouldn't say necessarily I agree with you saying that you should then discredit it as an adaptation, because working within constraints to tell a good story is something worth merit. I also am not wholly against the idea of studios using the material an author wrote to springboard off to tell a new story, as long as it doesn't disrespect the source material and doesn't claim to be the exact same thing. We've seen a few examples of that, of adaptations from books going in very creatively different directions. This was actually very prominent in the 80s and 90s, more so than it is now. But yeah, I'm not wholly against actually the idea you're putting forward, a more loose adaptation. I think loose adaptation is fine. What bothers me more is when things don't go fully one way or the other, like fully loose adaptation or fully strict adaptation. I don't like it when there's changes for no purpose. And I think that's the core of the argument we're talking about here, right? We as fans of source material don't like changes without a purpose. It's not always easy to tell at the beginning of a show if a change was for a purpose or not. Maybe something they're changing in season 1 will pay off in movie 5, whatever they're working on. So in my opinion, whether or not something's a good adaptation in the sense you're talking about usually takes hindsight, because telling a full story, especially of a 5+ book series, becomes more and more difficult the more and more books into it you get, and you have to prep for some of those changes down the road by changing things early on. This becomes so mushy, whooshy, wibbly wobbly. Even looking at Lord of the Rings, what's really funny to me is how many people claim that's a great adaptation in the sense you're talking about, when in reality they changed a lot. For those movies, characters dropped, pacing entirely changed, lore changes so much, and people are going, no, it's a great adaptation. In the exact opposite sense you're saying. I would say the Lord of the Rings movies are a poor adaptation in the sense that they drastically changed Lord of the Rings material, but they're a good adaptation in the sense that all of those changes were needed and justified to tell the story right through the medium they're going to. So I agree and disagree. Not a huge rebuttal. I just think it's a bit unfair to count the volumes of Lord of the Rings separately in your title tier list, considering Tolkien wrote it to be one book and didn't really wish to have separate books with separate names. Yeah, if I wanted to honor Tolkien right, I probably should have done that right, but I had to look at it through the true publication sense, as I did with everything else. And if I'm looking at the true publication sense, there are 3 Lord of the Rings titles for each book. But if I was going to go ahead and say the Lord of the Rings as a title ranking, that would be S tier. It's a freaking phenomenal name for a book. Or series, whichever you want to count it as. A story is not made complete when it gets a live action movie or TV show adaptation. Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or even Wheel of Time are all already complete stories regardless of adaptation. To imply that a story needs an adaptation to be fully complete is insulting not only to the original work, but to the medium that work was presented in as a whole. I completely agree with this, 100%, and that's why I get so weirded out when people say like, oh, this adaptation is going to destroy the series we all love. How? Avatar's legacy is still amazing, and everyone just kind of forgot M. Night Shyamalan's disaster. No one brings that up in casual conversation. No one thinks that's what you're talking about when you bring up Avatar: The Last Airbender. No, instead they think you're talking about these blue f***ers over here. They don't think you're talking about the live action thing. Bad adaptations tend to be forgotten after decades go by, and the source material, whether book, video game, what have you, is still looked on fondly. Authors shouldn't write a sequel or prequel just for more money. That's so easy to say when you're not in their position, and this is going to be something that might be news to some of you and just old news to others. Just because an author has one book that sells really well doesn't necessarily mean they're well off or made for good. In fact, one book that does really well, depending on the deal they have with their publisher, they can see little to no return on. But suddenly they can come back in with weight to that publisher and say, I get a much better cut that will set myself and my family up, and it's going to be a sequel or prequel that wasn't necessarily planned. On the outside looking in, it's easy to throw stones, but if you're in that author's position where suddenly your work is making a ton of money and it's not making it necessarily for you in a very fair sense, coming back in and saying, no, I'm going to get a bigger piece of the pie this time, even if it wasn't entirely set up in the original text, is a very tempting thing I'm not going to judge people for, because I don't know if I'd say no in the same situation. It sounds awful, but no, money doesn't buy happiness, but it certainly buys an alleviation from stress and alleviation from all kinds of worries in life that can then make you extremely unhappy. So if there's an author who wrote a complete story and then suddenly comes out with an unplanned prequel or sequel, as long as they're putting their heart into it and doing the best they can, I do not fault them at all for trying to make that money, because hey, it's very, very easy to throw stones from the outside looking in, and I just don't want to join that mob. Fantasy's preoccupation with representing monarchism and classical aristocracy in ways that either make them seem much less violent or anti-egalitarian than they were, or even worse, a desirable system, totally ruin a lot of stories. There are some obvious counterexamples like Game of Thrones and Witcher, but I'm not saying it's a uniform problem, just that it's far too common. I'm not sure how much of this is due to Tolkien or people not realizing that... Okay. I know what you're saying here, and you're entirely right. Yes, monarchy was a god-awful system of government. Well, there were certainly more fair and just kings and queens out there that deserve the slightly better reputations than a lot of their peers had. In general, a monarch was kind of an awful situation for the lower class to experience because, you know, you didn't have any form of rights, really? You had some, but they could be taken away or ignored at the whim of your monarch and local lord. So, yeah, you're not wrong, but you also pointed out that we're seeing this die out. Not only are two of the biggest fantasy series currently, Witcher and Game of Thrones, like you mentioned, rallying against this mentality, but I would say a majority of fantasy that has been coming out recently, I've been reading at least, very much so embraces the mentality you're talking about of saying, hey, one person, this much power, bad idea. They shouldn't remake Avatar: The Last Airbender in the form they're planning to. If it has the same medium and writers, it doesn't feel like it has anything to add to the table. That is a hot take, and I think one that'll actually really divide Avatar fans, because I know a lot of Avatar fans are really excited about this live-action adaptation because it has the original people coming back largely to help create it. So what I'm going to do is disagree, because I genuinely think this take is wrong for most people. For me, I feel more wonder, more immersion in a story if it's live action. I can't immerse myself in an anime. There's a few exemptions to this, pretty much everything I've seen from Studio Ghibli, but largely I feel more wonder if it's live action. And I think a lot of people agree with me with that. So I'm really excited to re-experience Avatar: The Last Airbender in a way that'll let me immerse myself more. You, as someone who's used to watching anime or who actually can immerse themselves more through the medium of anime, yeah, it might have a lot less to bring to the table for you. But seeing the writers come back in this way, I'm excited to see what they want to tweak, what little changes they're going to make here and there, because they have hindsight now and they can look at things and go, we could tell that better, we could change this. And I'm not saying across the board their changes could be better, but I'm pretty sure they're going to make some slight changes, and it'll be very interesting to see the discussions that sparks among the fan base. Anyway, this has been my latest edition of Let's Debate. I do have quite the controversial video coming down the pipes that should be out within the next week or two. It's gonna cause some waves, and I just want the community to brace for that. Just get ready for me to be putting forth a video that has literally been months in the making and has required more research than any college paper I ever did.